Julia Friedrich is a research fellow at the Global Public Policy Institute, GPPI. She has participated in many fascinating studies, but the one we're going to talk about today is how Russia came to apparently liberate Ukraine, but left those areas and those peoples with nothing. This report looks at what life under Russian occupation looks like. Julia, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to the channel and to talk about what is obviously a very intense subject, but it's one that has great importance for the idea of Ukraine liberating those occupied territories. How did you come to study this area, and in particular, this topic of occupation?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This is part of a larger research project that looks at various aspects of occupation. So some colleagues are looking, are explicitly focusing on issues like collaboration or the sort of the Russian structures that are used to govern occupied territory. But I wanted to specifically look at Ukrainians' experiences of occupation with the aim to humanize these occupation experiences by shedding light on the stories of those who already lived through it. Because I feel like we have a tendency of looking at, advances at the front, and like how many square kilometers are under whose control, but that sometimes leads to us losing sight of what that actually means for the people who populate these areas.
And it's a topic that gets not nearly as much attention, I think, as it should do. And if we go back to historic times and we look at, say, Vichy and so on, there are a lot of studies. There's a lot of emphasis on what it's like to live under occupation, and a lot of the stories of that period. Whether it's forming national identities in the Netherlands and other places, it's a pretty big part of the story. Why is it that occupation is so obscured when it comes to Ukraine? Because when you talk to individual Ukrainians, some of whom have relatives in those territories, it's not an obscure subject. It's an absolutely central subject to them, but it certainly seems to be obscured and misunderstood in the global media. Why do you think that might be?
Well, I think there's several reasons. I feel like when the first territories were liberated by the Ukrainian army, there, and especially in the face of the war crimes that were uncovered specifically around Kiev city and in Kiev region, I think there was like a lot of international attention, mostly focused on the war crime aspect of it. But then I think there's a factor that is the time. So it's been going on for a while, and people have gotten used to it, as people have gotten used to the fact that areas of the Donbas have been occupied for 10 years effectively. Um, and then there's another aspect, I think, is the security situation, which means that we know a lot less also about, for example, or at least in media presence, I think there are less stories about war crimes and occupation experiences in Kharkiv region, for example, or in Kherson region, just because it's very difficult and dangerous to go there. So less people do so. So we know more about the war crimes that happened close to Kiev because it's safer to research them, also for internationals to go. So I think that influences our perception. Um, yeah, so I think it's the time and it's the security situation. Um, and then I think there's an aspect of like, because the war is ongoing, kind of focusing on these frontline developments rather than looking sort of at the stories or looking at the individual experience and how it factors into the war. And because I think maybe once the war ends in some way, I think there might be more research coming. But I think because the story is not finished in a way, so maybe that's why there's also less people looking into this.
Do we need, I mean, obviously the media works on very visual, it needs photos, images in order to tell a story. And one of the challenges, of course, here is that those photos and videos don't necessarily exist from people behind occupation. When we saw Kherson taken, then there was a sort of flash of media coverage because you could actually speak to people, you could see that liberation actually meant something, that it was real, and that substantial numbers of people quite clearly did not want to be occupied. Um, could it be that there will be a sort of triggering moment when that happens? Um, or is it going to take more than that to really sort of, bring this to full attention?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a very difficult topic to research as well, because, and this is something I encountered as well during the research for the study that we're talking about, that some people just didn't want to talk about their experiences. For one, because they didn't want to go back to that place. I think, and for the people who spoke to me, some of them really wanted to get the word out, and they were eager to tell their story, but it was still like a difficult conversation to have. And so some people just want to move on with their lives, and others are just also quite afraid of being reoccupied, because in some places that were occupied, the Russians were pushed out not very far. And so the risk of reoccupation is real, and of being persecuted for anything you might say in the meantime. So, again, I think that's why maybe if there's ever an end to any of this, then I think that that'll be a moment that gives rise to more of these stories coming to light. But of course, by then, a lot of things will have happened already, and a lot of stories will never be told, which is very
And
sad.
I don't know if this is a useful concept, but in speaking to Ilya Ponomarev, one of the Russian opposition leaders who takes let's say, a more combative line in tackling Putin's regime than many of the Russian opposition, we discussed the idea that, again, Putin's regime is often compared, is he as bad as Stalin? Is he not, etc. And because there isn't physical gulag. Well, there are gulags, but because there isn't an entire gulag network on the territory of Russia, there aren't millions and millions of people being incarcerated. He tends not yet to be seen in this bracket. But we looked at this concept that actually what he's done here is outsourced the gulag to the occupied territories. You have absolute impunity, you have terror, you have torture, you have imprisonment, you have a total lack of rule of law. And that not just applies to Ukrainians, but also, Russian conscripts, soldiers, etc., in essence, are not allowed outside of the zone, and they're kept there until effectively they either, die for a variety of reasons. Is it a useful idea to actually look at the occupied territories as a form of gulag or, Stalinism?
Well, I would say that what we know about Stalinism now, and what we know about how the Gulag system worked, that's the product of many decades of work and research and time passing and archives opening up, right? And there are actually a lot of things we still don't know about the Gulag, because the archives were open for such a short amount of time only in Russia. And a lot of things we will probably never know, actually. So I think those comparisons are difficult to make if you're still living through one situation and the other one is so far in the past. And to me, one of the central features actually of sort of political repression in Russia in the 1930s and the Gulag system is that the sort of like that victims and perpetrators, like who was perpetrator of a first generation, could become a victim in the second generation, which I think does not apply to, Ukrainian occupation. And you have this whole aspect of territoriality and of someone coming to install a new rule in a place that had an existing rule that worked completely fine for the people who live there, who are Ukrainians, and then you have this external actor who comes and occupies them. And I think with the Gulag system, I mean, much of it happened within Russia, which also makes it so difficult to talk about it for Russians, because the line between victims and perpetrators are blurred. So, and I guess what I'm saying is that maybe in 20 years we could make that comparison, and maybe I think there can be useful sort of parallels to be drawn. But right now, I'm not sure if we know enough to kind of make that like a substantial comparison.
Given how difficult it is then to sort of put together definitive sort of research at this stage, what do we know about the change in, I don't want to call it rule of law, but essentially governance of those territories, if you compare how they were prior to 2014, and then obviously that long sort of period of long occupation and to an extent the sort of banditry that sort of took over there. And there's still obviously a lot of argument about the scale of involvement and direction given by the Russian state. But essentially, how would you characterize the main differences between occupation governance and how it was prior to 2014?
I think it's hard to even compare those two, and I think that's one of the essential arguments of the study is that Russian occupation is more than just there's another flag up on City Hall in most of the places. As far as we can generalize, again, there's a limited sort of body of evidence and research, but from what we know, we can say that it's definitely not just rule by another name. So for most of these people, especially the start of the occupation was just highly chaotic. A lot of people just did not know what was going on, and suddenly there were tanks rolling in, and then suddenly people understood somehow that they were under occupation, but that also took some time to figure out. And a lot of people were just very scared. So an interviewee in Kharkiv region, for example, told me about their neighbor who just didn't leave their house for the entire 6 months duration of occupation because they were too scared to go out. And every one of the interviewees I spoke to said that, in the first days we were kind of looking, okay, can I even leave my house, and how far can I go? And so it's just a complete state of chaos and sort of surrealness. So that I think that's the initial stage. And then as occupation, where it's allowed to last and where it can endure, and then it becomes different. I mean, there's a return of a degree of normalcy, but it's not a normal if that makes sense. So it's still a system that is based on structural violence against those who are not approving of the new rule, and it's a system of like violent integration of these territories into Russia's administrative and economic structures. So the longer occupation can last, the closer the territories are actually sort of pulled into the Russian administration and the Russian system and the Russian state, which means also that the longer occupation lasts, the harder it becomes to reverse, because you would have to sort of reverse all of that, which will be an immense task. And there's also an element of demographic change. So I think a lot of people read stories about how houses were being sold from Mariupol were being like sold on the Russian markets. Like, hey, this is a cheap flat you can buy. And so with the aim of getting Russians to settle in Mariupol, so that means that even in the event of liberation, the demographic that lives there will just be an entirely different one than the one that it was before.
That suggests, and this is obviously a difficult process, but it's close enough in time that if those territories were liberated, you could see a legal process of restitution. Now, obviously, many of the residents of Mariupol did not make it out of that city and are now buried amongst the ruins, or even the new apartments that Russia is building. So full restitution, of course, is going to be difficult, but some partial restitution may be possible. That would, in essence, involve essentially kicking out the people who are living on bones, who are living on blood, who have essentially stolen the lifestyles and properties of people who used to live there. Is that, when you speak to Ukrainians, have they expressed any idea that for them victory would involve some kind of restitution in that way?
To be honest, no. I had one interviewee from Mariupol. They now live abroad, and I'm not sure if they think that they will return to Mariupol in their lifetime. So it wasn't really I mean, I also didn't explicitly ask about it, but that wasn't really something that came up. They said that they escaped because they couldn't bear the thought of living there with the occupiers after everything that happened during the siege. But they didn't. I don't think they. Again, I don't think they think that they will be able to return to Mariupol ever. So.
That's yeah, I know some families from that city, and that's exactly. I don't think they imagine they could go back, and if they were presented with that choice, it's a tough one, isn't it? Because knowing what happened and the experiences they underwent to actually escape it, in many cases, extremely traumatizing. So, for those who did survive, for those who are under occupation, you've written very interestingly here about this idea of what can be considered collaboration, because I think in our minds, if we think of various other wars, then if you're involved in some kind of active resistance or active protest, then that could be considered resistance to the enemy, and so on. But you've written about sort of what constitutes collaboration. You've also written about what constitutes for the Russian authorities in this territory, an offensive act, an act which could get them punishment, whether it's imprisonment, and of course we know also potentially torture and so on. So, how would you define these differences between resistance and collaboration, and what the local Russian administration would class within those?
So I think so from what interviewees told me was that the occupiers were very interested, if not obsessed, with gathering information about the places they were or the people living in the places they were occupying. And so in that process of information gathering, they were specifically looking for people with sort of who displayed pro-Ukrainian sentiment. But I think it's important to emphasize that this was not an accurate search. So they would also could really randomly, like one person from Kiev region told me about acquaintances who were arrested because they quote unquote looked fit. So it wasn't an exact science, to say the least. So of course there were people who were especially at risk. For example, people who were veterans of the Donbas war, because obviously the occupiers would think that they would be pro-Ukrainian. So these were specifically at risk. I also interviewed someone who was an IDP from 2014 from Luhansk region, and they were also very afraid that the occupiers would sort of persecute them for not being loyal to Russia somehow. But so there's this targeted violence, but there's also a random aspect of violence. In terms of resistance, my interviewees told me about a full range of things. So one person, or actually several persons, told me that they communicated Russian army positions to the Ukrainian army, which was a super dangerous endeavor. And they said that if you were caught, you could be sort of shot on the spot. But for them, it was an important part of surviving occupation, to feeling connected to the Ukrainian military and to feeling like you were contributing and not everything was lost. But I also interviewed someone who said, I was a soldier of the invisible front. And so they just did not want to interact with the occupiers, and they were doing what they could sort of below the radar. And then collaboration, that was also a range of things that were discussed, sort of, right? And a lot of people, a lot of interviewees were actually quite dissatisfied with the way that collaboration has been dealt with in the territories that were liberated, because there was forced collaboration and there was voluntary collaboration. It can be very difficult to tell the two apart, who was forced to give up names of their neighbors or who did so voluntarily. There's a sense that one person, for example, from Kherson region said that, the trash picking company that continued operating under occupation to pick the trash because it had to go somewhere, they were prosecuted quite strictly. Whereas other cases of high profile collaboration where they felt like people were actually trying to gain from Russian occupation, they were not. And the Ukrainian law, I mean, this goes a bit beyond this text, but the Ukrainian law on collaboration is also quite, it remains an ill-defined concept. And I think this will pose, this can potentially pose a lot of trouble in the future as well, especially because as occupation lasts longer and the pressures become higher, for example, to accept a Russian passport, then if that's considered an act of collaboration, the longer occupation lasts, the harder it becomes for individuals not to do things that can be considered collaboration because they have no other choice. So it's a very difficult and also very painful and sensitive topic.
This is interesting, isn't it? Because obviously this is the work of future historians. But when for instance, the Stasi archives were sort of broken open, people could actually discover whether their neighbors had sort of snitched on them, spied on them, and so on. And that's because they're living in an obsessively bureaucratic state, and one that had quite despite its brutality, had a high level of functioning in terms of the bureaucracy to, document what essentially are its crimes and its spying activities and so on. would it be true to say that the sort of Donetsk and Luhansk are not nearly that sophisticated? So we may never know the extent. Do we even know if they're documenting this stuff, or is it just sort of happening on a whim, as it were? As you say, individual groups gathering information, doing interviews, etc., but not necessarily being sort of documented, recorded, and so on.
Well, there is some evidence, or some interviewees spoke to me about the occupiers having lists, like lists of activists and lists of people. Also, some people were warned prior to the invasion that they were on some sort of list and told to escape if they could. Um, so that suggests a degree of preparation, but there is, I mean, it's obviously very difficult to gather evidence about this. And so the existence of this list is not 100% confirmed. But what interviewees told me was that they were also very busy, like going to the city archives and like looking at public records. And then sometimes, like in Kherson, apparently they smashed the door of an apartment because a veteran used to live there many years ago, but had since sold the apartment and their information was quite outdated. So that I think that suggests a degree of preparation and of sort of systematic approach to this. But I think the extent to which I cannot judge to that by the research that I did.
You have also written that erasure of Ukrainian identity is a common theme. How central is it to the Russian occupation, and what are the various ways in which they seek to diminish or even erase Ukrainian identity?
I would say, based on the interviews that I did, that it's quite central to the Russian occupation, if not the central element. And it starts even quite subtly, like even in places that weren't under occupation for a very long time and where there wasn't like time for the Russians to do like a big campaign or whatever. The soldiers that were in these towns, they would tell people, we came to save you, and it's fine, you liberated now. So even where they didn't have time to set up any elaborate schemes, there's still like there was a very clear propaganda line that they were pursuing. And I mean, as occupation lasts, one of the main battlegrounds for this erasure of Ukrainian identity become the schools. So the school curricula are changed. There are also records of Ukrainian teachers going to Russia for some sort of course, and then having to teach this changed curriculum to Ukrainian children, which is obviously sort of much more Russian language based and has an alternative version of history that's presented to the children. So schools are very central in that effort to erase the identity. And then again, going back to the demographic change, that's one of the, I guess, most striking ways in which this happens, right? Because they're literally exchanging Russian people for Ukrainian people on these territories, trying to, make them Russian.
Do we have a sense of the scale at which that's happening? I heard a figure that in Crimea, and of course we're going back to 2014, it's a much longer period of occupation than some of the territories that were taken in 2022. But there you've had a huge population exchange. I saw one figure which is as many as 800,000 Russian, for want of a better word, colonists have been sort of imported in. And of course, many of the native Crimean Tatars who already were relatively minimal on the territory because of historic reasons, the Stalinist deportations, many of those have left. And of course, many people who would have been considered pro-Ukrainian or who became pro-Ukrainian under that occupation got out of that territory. Are we seeing a similar kind of population exchange on that scale in other occupied territories?
I haven't seen any credible numbers on this, and I'm not sure they exist. I think this is again something that we will only discover with time. I mean, of course, we now know a lot more about Crimea because it's been going on for 10 years. And so what my interviews told me was like anecdotal evidence of like, oh yes, they sent Russian doctors to Melitopol, but that's like rumors. So I think in terms of the numbers and the scale, I haven't. This would be a great thing to research actually, if there's a way that we can find these numbers.
Of course, depending on how those territories are liberated, we may never know, because I expect many of those people who do not think of themselves as colonists, but essentially if those territories were going to be reoccupied, I'm sure many of them would seek to flee back to Russia. So this may never actually be known. You've also written very compellingly here about violence. Of course, violence is absolutely central, not just the violence of war, which is the most obvious manifestation of Russia's invasion, but the actual systemic violence that is inflicted on people under occupation. And you've described it as a mixture of systemic in some cases, but also entirely chaotic and random in others. I mean, both are unfair. One, however, perhaps if it's systemic, you can figure out how to get around it. Where it's random and chaotic, that just is a form of terror. You just don't know when that violence is going to be inflicted. So, what did your interviews tell you about the use of violence by occupying forces?
Yeah, you're completely right that they what they described was broadly fit into these sort of two categories of more systemic and more chaotic violence. I had two interviewees who were detained and tortured for sort of pro-Ukrainian activity. One of them was a Donbas war veteran. One of them actually collected the device that was used to torture them from the interrogation basement in after liberation, and then they also just pulled it out during the interview, which was obviously quite a shocking moment for me there. And then I think they had a lot more problems making sense of the chaotic kind of violence. So, and especially I think those who were spared this sort of random violence, they were a bit unsure why, and they tried to like find some explanation. So, oh, I was very careful, or I lived in a poor, like in an apartment that looked poor, and so they didn't search it, and usually they were violent during searches, so that's why I was spared. But the truth is, like, this we don't know. And I think that was also so hard on them. And then I want to emphasize also that there were just different forms of violence. So one interviewee in Kharkiv region was in a village sort of very close to the front line, and they never actually spoke to the occupiers, but their position was quite close to their house. So the Russian position was quite close to their house, and they had to cook outside on a campfire because there was no electricity, gas, or anything. Um, and then there was they saw a soldier playing around with their gun, and then they noticed there was like this red dot, like this infrared dot on their like chest and arm, and so the soldier was kind of aiming at them, kind of playing around, and in the interviewee they said like I knew I couldn't run, there was no point, and I was just standing there and waiting to die essentially. And then the soldier didn't shoot. I think it was, and they said, I think it was entertaining for them. So there are also more indirect, quote unquote, forms of violence that interviewees experience that are all just really terrifying and horrible.
And this is going to be, I think, very difficult to understand. But do we know how far the regime that is imposed in that territory? Do you know how far that it's military, or is it these sort of militia that came about from 2014 onwards and then went into form the administration? Or do we have evidence of actual sort of FSB and GRU guiding, directing, and being implanted into the regime there? Or is it very difficult at this point to really figure out what's going on?
So for this question, you will need to read the rest of the publications from this research project, because there's one section that focuses specifically on this. What I can tell you is that as far as we know, there are sort of Ukrainians hired into these administrations, and often, like one person in Kherson said, people were selling apples on the street, and the next day they had like a high government position. So that can also be one way how people end up in these structures, but that the actual but that those are more like a front in a way, and then the actual administering and the actual power lies with Russian structures. But who exactly? Again, I will refer to the colleagues whose research will hopefully be published within the next half year.
Or maybe we can have some of them onto the channel. I think
Yeah,
that is a kind of interesting question as to how far it's guided and directed. And I know there's a lot of debate around that still. And
yeah.
one of the other things you've emphasized, and I think it's absolutely fascinating because it always struck me that one of the reasons why there is not a functioning opposition in Russia, at least one that's able to reach a critical mass to even prevent sort of Putinism, is the sheer lack of trust. And actually, that the
Mm-hmm.
Soviet system was very much geared on breaking human bonds, breaking solidarity, destroying the concept of community and the ability for people to sort of form networks, which at their more complex end, become political parties, pressure groups, and so on. Do we see under occupation also an attempt to destroy whatever sense of community and connectedness there might have been on the occupied territories prior to Russia's intervention there?
Yes, absolutely. That is one of the key features of occupation. Um, and I mean, some interviewees told me very sort of these very heartening stories of how, they were taking care of their neighbors, they were sharing water, sharing food, they were asking for medication. One person in Mariupol was like even approaching occupiers to ask for medication for their sick neighbor. So, these very like heartening stories of people coming closer together, which is of course like that's really touching, but that's not the majority of things that happen. Like what happens is that neighbors betray each other. The war veteran that I spoke about, they were betrayed by acquaintances of their daughter, who just told the occupiers that, oh yeah, there lives a war veteran, you should check them out, kind of. um, and so violence, like it just it does it breaks social ties. So as buildings are destroyed, the relations between people are destroyed. And in that climate of like not know like of fear, of absolute total fear, you don't know who to trust. And that trust doesn't just come back. So we also, in the territories that were liberated, we can see that these communities are really struggling to find the sense of community again, because collaborators live next to torture victims, and it's just it's hard for us, living in a peaceful country, to imagine this. But just the social foundation, the social fabric is just is destroyed by occupation and by the violence experienced. And so that's really a very crucial point for me in terms of the lasting effects also of occupation. No
And of
worries.
course, it's absolutely critical, isn't it? Because healthy economic activity, innovation, the kind of innovation we see in the unoccupied areas of Ukraine, which are delivering some extraordinary successes on the battlefield and in taking back the Black Sea, the kind of innovations that we're seeing there around technology and then tactics within the military. Trust is absolutely central to making that happen. So the complete erosion and destruction of trust in the occupied territories, that has long-term implications for their economic vitality, and even viability.
Yes, definitely. And I mean, in 2021, I did some research in the Donbas region, about sort of social cohesion and different groups. I was specifically looking at veterans and IDPs and sort of regular citizens and how their relations to each other. And there it was really quite stark, the to see, really quite shocking for me, just how, even though that was only in Ukrainian government controlled territory, but still it was marked by war so much that there was just very little trust, and very little interaction even between the different groups. And then there are all sorts of also economic grievances, right? Like someone who would live in a village close to the front line, then who wouldn't get compensation or some sort of international aid, but then IDPs would, and so there are some resentments. Very natural. I think we all have to also, I mean, ask ourselves, what would it do with us? Like the situation is extremely, it's dangerous and it's stressful and it's awful. It's that it doesn't bring out like the best in people. Obviously, that's, you can't expect that, right? So yeah, that's also part of the very long-lasting economic consequences. And if I may add, in the occupied territories in the Donbas, even prior to 2022, I think one of the big problems was also that because of lack of innovation, the only jobs that were available were government jobs, which again brings us back to this point that the longer occupation lasts, the harder it is not to do things that are considered collaboration, because what are you going to do if you need to feed a family? So yeah.
And that's absolutely functioning, and the people, I think, don't quite understand that that's some of the functioning of the Russian state itself. All money, all funds, all jobs ultimately are connected to the state, even if they're quasi-private, and you risk losing that income. So we're approaching the last, I think, two questions, and this situation of lack of opportunity and also moral, dubious moral choices. There's no good choices for someone living under occupation. Certain individuals will decide to stay for various reasons, and others will decide to leave because they'll say to themselves that this is no longer something I can, that I will either survive or want to be any part of. What are the factors that push somebody to either stay or leave? And now we're into more than 10 years of occupation in some territories. What actually are the options if someone does decide they want to get out?
That was for me one of the most important and findings of the research, and maybe one of the most surprising ones also. I think we tend to think that, if you don't like the regime, then you just go. And so we also, I think, we tend to think that the people who stayed under occupation, they would be, at least fine kind of with the Russian rule over them. But that's not, like, political allegiance is not, at least from what I gathered in my interviews, that was not a main factor in why people would stay or would leave. So we have to understand that, first of all, leaving, especially in the early days of occupation, was a very dangerous activity. So it was not clear if you would survive it, and if it was maybe wiser to stay and wait a little bit, to understand whether it was even possible to leave. So that's number one. It's dangerous. Number two is, it's expensive, especially now. The only way for a lot of people, is to go through Russia rather than sort of cross the front lines. That, I mean, is quite logical. And a couple in Kherson region, they paid $10,000 for this escape, via Russia to the Baltics, and then again through the EU to Ukraine. So that's not funds that everyone has like readily available. And then there are other more social factors. So family members, with some people, I think, especially with children, it was quite clear that they wanted to escape because that was like a factor that pushed them to leave. But other people had to take care of elderly parents, or one person, for instance, had to take care of their 90-year-old father, and they just needed some time to figure out how to even transport them. And you can't do this, I don't know, 48-hour trip through Russia with a 90-year-old sick person. So that the family ties are one very important factor why people decide to stay. And then there's also an element of just being able to imagine like a different life in another place. Not all Ukrainians are like super mobile. Actually, as a society, they weren't for a long time, and now they've had to be. But it can be a very difficult choice, especially if you don't speak a foreign language or if you don't have anyone to go to. And vice versa, people who had family or acquaintances in Western Ukraine or in Central Ukraine, or even abroad, who told them, you can stay with me, just come here, we'll figure it out. That was obviously a factor that supported them in their decision to escape. So it's a very complex decision, and it's not as clear cut to say, who's still around there, they're in favor of Russian rule. Like, that's not.
And your report sort of concludes pointing out the terrible human cost of occupation. Of course, in the media and in much of the dialogue, it's framed in territorial terms. And unfortunately, this whole idea, which most Ukrainians don't buy into, but the idea of peace for land, one has to question what kind of peace that is under occupation after the conversation we've had. But it's often seen in territorial terms, where actually the scale of suffering is very much on the human level. So in doing that study, what was your impression of that, and what's the legacy for the future? We're looking here, I assume, about generations of trauma, psychological trauma, and social and political trauma, even once this is over.
Yes, I mean, I with the study, I tried to kind of have the results stand for themselves. But obviously, the conclusion is that if we look at again, my aim was to humanize occupation, right? And so if we look at the human cost, then that is something that absolutely has to be factored into these discussions about, oh, if we just freeze the front line there, or like some territory in exchange for this, like that has tragic consequences for the people involved and for families who are torn apart, maybe forever. And I asked many interviewees about their coping strategies and how they managed to sort of survive occupation or to live through it. And one of them said, like, you need to have at least a little bit of hope. Like, you need to have at least a very small light at the end of the tunnel in order to make it through it. And that's very heartening, but it's also heartbreaking if you consider that for many of these territories, like, this light is incredibly small, if it's still existing. And so that's just to illustrate that it's not just about land, it's about people. And of course the trauma that's induced here, like, it will last for generations, and we know that trauma passes through other generations. And what concerns me the most is again these war crimes that we will just never know. So in Mariupol, like, the traces of war crimes are being erased as we're speaking, and we will never know what happened there. And we know, like, that makes it all the harder to move on from this kind of trauma, both individually but also as a society. So that's very very worrying. And so again, the true stakes of this war is the lives of the people who are directly affected by it.
Where we don't know, it's difficult to have any kind of restitution. It's difficult to have any kind of justice. And that is, I think, one of the importance of the kind of work you're doing, but it's one of the tragedies that so many of these stories will remain untold, and so many of the perpetrators of these crimes will go unpunished. But we will put links to your work, Julia, in the description of the video. It's been a real pleasure speaking to you and taking this sort of short dive into the extensive research that you're doing. I think this is a topic we should definitely revisit. As you say, you're producing more work and your colleagues are all the time. I would love to have the opportunity to dig into that. But for now, thank you so much for coming on the channel.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan.